Hello there! In this video, we are going to talk about API versioning and explore the options we have in ASP.NET Core. We'll cover both the regular and minimal APIs, so try to stick around until the end of this one. So, let's start with the versioning implementation. We're going to use two packages, ASP versioning.mvc and ASP versioning MVC API Explorer. They allow us to easily implement versioning in our ASP.NET Core applications with a few configuration lines. That said, let's install them. Let's open a package manager console and install the ASP versioning.mvc package first. Also, let's repeat the previous command and just add API Explorer for the second package. After the installation, let's set up the main configuration for versioning inside the program class. So, let's call the builder services.addAPI versioning method to add our API versioning to the list of services in our app. It accepts an action delegate as a parameter, so let's add one. Now, we can use this parameter to access the assumed default version when unspecified property and set it to true. With this property, we set a value indicated whether a default version is assumed when the client doesn't provide an API version. In this case, we want that. Also, let's set the default API version property to a new API version and set the default version for our endpoints. Let's also use the report API versions property and set it to true. When this property is set to true, the HTTP headers, API supported versions and API deprecated versions will be added to all valid service routes. Finally, because we are going to support different version schemes, with the API version reader property, we combine different ways of reading the API version. In this case, we will use the query string API version reader to support versioning with query strings. And the parameter name will be API version. Also, let's add the header API version reader for the header support. And finally, the media type API version reader for the media type support. Now, in addition to this configuration, we can use the addAPI Explorer method to add some additional extensions for the API versioning. This method also accepts an action delegate as a parameter, so let's add it. Here, we will specify the format code with the group name format to format the version as v_major_minor status. Furthermore, we will add another property, substitute API version in URL, which is only necessary when versioning by the URI segment. Now, you can see we prepared some test data inside the data class to test different API versions. Our sample project will return different strings on different versions. API version 1.0 is going to return strings starting with B. Version 2 is going to return strings starting with S, and version 3 is going to return strings starting with C. Great. After everything is prepared, let's check the versioning schemes. Let's start with the query string parameter versioning. The default versioning scheme is query string parameter versioning. We have already set a name for the query string parameter, which is API version, that we are going to use to send versioning information. Now, inside the v1 folder, we already have prepared a controller with an action to return strings starting with B. The logic is pretty simple here. The main part though is for us to add the versioning here. To do that, we use the API version with 1.0 attribute to set the version of the controller. And that's all it takes. As I said, the query string is default versioning scheme and we can test it right away. Let's start the app, open Postman, and send version information as a query string parameter in a GET request. We can see that all the strings starting with B are returned as a response. It is easy as that. Now, let's move on to the media and header API versioning. This type of versioning makes URI stay clean because we only modify the accept header values. In this case, the scheme preserves our URIs between versions. That said, let's open another prepared controller in the v2 folder. Again, the logic is the same, and all we need to do to add versioning to this controller is to use the API version attribute and set the 2.0 value as a version value. Now, let's start the application again. And we can send versioning information by providing X version in the request header, as we configured with the header API version reader class in our configuration. Okay, let's send a request. And clearly we see that version 2.0 is selected in the custom header, and strings starting with S are returned. Now, in addition to sending version information in headers, we can do the same via media type header. In our configuration, we use media type API version reader with VER to state that this parameter should be a version information header. So, let's use this request with the provided accept header. Let's send it, and we get the same result here. Finally, since we now have two controllers, we can test what is going to happen if we send a request without version information. Well, as you can see, the default version is selected, and strings starting with B are returned to the client. Excellent. Now we can move on to the URI versioning. URI versioning is the most common versioning scheme because the version information is easy to read right from the URI, so it is an advantage. To see this in action, we're going to use another prepared controller inside the v3 folder. As you can see, our action simply returns strings starting with C. Now, let's modify the route attribute and set a route substitution stating that the API version must be in the URI with the v version API version format. Also, we will use again the API version attribute and set it to 3.0. That's it. Let's start the application again and use another request where we include the required version in our request. Let's send this one. And our API returns all the strings starting with C. Now we can talk about deprecating the previous versions in our APIs. As new features are added to the API and the old versions start to increase in numbers, supporting old API contracts introduces maintenance overhead. Due to this maintenance overhead, we need a way to get rid of old versions. API versioning package allows us to flag APIs as deprecated. This gives time for the client to prepare changes. Otherwise, immediately deleting older APIs could give a bad taste to the clients. This is something we never want to do. That said, all you have to do to set the deprecated version is to use an additional deprecated property in the API version attribute. Since our example now includes a version 3 endpoint, let's update our code to mark version 1 as deprecated. So, as said, let's add the deprecated property here and set it to true. That's all it takes. Since we are marking version 1 as deprecated, it's a good idea to also update our builder configuration to set version 2 as the default endpoint. Now, API version 1.0 is deprecated, and the client will get this information from the API deprecated versions header in the response. So, let's check this out. Let's send the first request with the 1.0 version. We can still see our result, but if we inspect the headers tab of the response, we can see the information about the deprecated and supported versions. Finally, let's see how we can do the same with Minimal API. To use versions with Minimal APIs, we have to add a new package. Let's install it. The package is ASP versioning HTTP. After the installation, we have to provide a configuration for Minimal APIs versioning as we did for the regular ones. This time, we have to create a new variable to extract the configuration values. To do that, we use the app.newAPIVersionSet method that creates and returns a new API version set builder for the specified endpoints. Now, we can attach the hasDeprecated API version method to state which version is deprecated. And in our case, it's an API version 1.0. Also, let's use the hasAPI version and provide the value of the API version to 2.0, and let's copy this line and paste it, and change the value to 3. Additionally, as we did in the previous configuration, we are going to add the header information with the report API versions method. Lastly, we need to build this configuration. Now, let's simply paste 3 endpoints here, since they will do the same thing we saw with the regular ones. We can see all 3 of these are just returning different strings based on a different version. But what is more important here are those 2 methods below each endpoint. We assign our version set to each of them by using the withAPIVersionSet method. This method associates a given endpoint with the version set object that we created previously. Also, we are using the mapToAPIVersion method to specify the version of the endpoint. In our case, we have 3 endpoints with the same URI, but different versions. The first is 1.0, the second is for version 2.0, and the third is for version 3.0. You can see it is pretty easy to use versioning with Minimal API as well. Excellent. So let's finish this video. Please don't forget to subscribe and also hit that like button if you like the video. If you want to get notifications from our channel about future videos, you can also use the bell button. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one. Until then, all the best.